The 20th Amendment, in my view, undoes 40 years of slow, incremental campaign and work and advocacy to reform the 1978 Constitution, to reform the aspect of the 1978 Constitution which is most problematic, and that is the concentration of power in the office of the executive president. The term that is often used to describe the presidential system under the 78 Constitution is problematic. Very often people say that Sri Lanka has a semi-presidential system or has a hybrid presidential parliamentary system. And I think the problem with that terminology is that it suggests that somehow the presidency is not too powerful, semi-presidential. But I think it is possible to argue that the so-called semi-presidential system under the 1978 Constitution actually concentrates power in the office of the presidency even more than in countries which claim to have a pure presidential system. And I think it's very interesting that a number of constitutional scholars in recent years have demonstrated the link between semi-presidentialism and hyper-presidentialism. And the reason for that is that if you look at the parliamentary executive model on the one hand and the pure presidential system on the other, each of them, which have a long tradition and history, have their own system of checks and balances, their own logic. And in a mixed system, the problem often is that the checks and balances of both are absent in that mix. So, for example, in the so-called pure presidential system in the United States of America, President Trump cannot dissolve Parliament or the Congress. President Trump cannot assign to himself cabinet portfolios, including the Ministry of Finance. But in Sri Lanka, the president under the 1978 Constitution could do both those things and can do both those things. And so for many years, there has been a campaign to try and reduce the power of the presidency, to impose checks and balances, with particular reference to the enormous powers that the president has with regard to appointments. So the appointment power of the president under the Sri Lankan Constitution is significant. The president, under the original 1978 Constitution, had sole discretion to appoint cabinet ministers, secretaries to ministries, heads of the armed forces, the IGP, the Attorney General, the Auditor General, judges of the appellate courts, the Commissioner of Elections, public servants appointed by the cabinet over which he presides, and also after the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, governors who, as we know, exercise more power in reality than chief ministers. And the important point is that under the 1978 Constitution, there was no consultation or ratification process. Right? We all know that President Trump has controversially nominated someone to the Supreme Court, but her appointment will have to be reviewed and ratified by the Senate Judiciary Committee. In Sri Lanka, we don't have any kind of ratification or approval process. So the appointment power of the presidency is enormous. Secondly, Article 35, the immunity clause in the Constitution, gives the president complete immunity from any kind of legal prosecution. And thirdly, our president has the power to legislate Under the state of emergency, the president can promulgate emergency regulations that have the effect of trumping legislation passed by Parliament. Fourth, the president can dissolve Parliament under the 1978 Constitution within 1 year of a parliamentary election, no requirement of consultation. In France, the president has to consult the prime minister and the presidents of the two legislative assemblies. And fifthly, I think this is an important point, you can't only look at the powers of the president in isolation, you have to also look at the countervailing powers of other democratic institutions. And the power of the legislature over the president is extremely weak. And because of the absence of judicial review of legislation and the immunity clause that I referred to earlier, the powers of the judiciary vis-a-vis the president are also extremely weak. So the cumulative effect of the powers of the president on the one hand, the weak powers of the legislature and the judiciary on the other, I would argue, suggests that in Sri Lanka, we have a hyper-presidential system, and with the 20th Amendment, we are going to make it even more hyper than a semi-presidential or a pure presidential system. The other point that I'd like to make is that if you look at the campaign for change in the 80s and in the 90s, the biggest critics of the 1978 Constitution with respect to the powers vested in the office of the presidency are some of the senior political leaders in the government of today. I'm sure you can all remember Dinesh Gunawardena, Vasudeva Nanakara, Sarat Muttettuwagama, Dew Gunasekwa, and how they criticized the enormous powers vested in the executive presidency in Parliament in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. And that's an extremely interesting point. What has happened? Why have they changed their views, or seem to have changed their views? Now, if you look at, I'd like to remind you also about a couple of landmarks in this campaign. Soon after the JVP insurrection of the late 80s, you had President Premadasa appointing a presidential commission on youth unrest. Right? The report was published in 1990. Among the members of the Youth Commission were Radhika Kumarasamy, G.L. Piris, the academic, and a number of media personalities as well. And one of the main recommendations of the Presidential Commission on Youth Unrest was that key institutions of governance should be depoliticized. Many of these members of the Commission spoke about the fact that as they went around the country talking to young people, the biggest complaint or concern that young people had was that every institution seemed to be politicized. And I'll mention from the report some of the phrases that were part of the recommendation. The politicization of recruitment to the public service, undermining democratic institutions through politicization, political interference in public administration. And it was after this report that the Premadasa All-Party Conference recommended the establishment of something called the Nominations Commission, an attempt to ensure that all important appointments to key positions should be done in a bipartisan approach. Unfortunately, that failed. And then if you look at the 95 to 2000 process, one of the key aspects of the unsuccessful attempt at introducing a new constitution was the establishment of the Constitutional Council. The idea of a Constitutional Council came from the Nepal Constitution of 1990. Again, an attempt to ensure that the opposition, political parties across the political spectrum were involved in appointing judges and members of the Human Rights Commission, etc. So we then have the 2000 Constitution Bill again failed. We then have 2001, the JVP making use of a political opportunity, some space that was created to insist that the 17th Amendment be introduced. And the 17th Amendment basically managed then to introduce changes that reduced the enormous powers of the president and establish the Constitutional Council and independent commissions. Now, the 17th Amendment was done away with by the 18th Amendment, which fortunately was short-lived. And then we had the 19th Amendment, basically reintroducing the provisions of the 17th Amendment with a couple of changes. The Constitutional Council composition was changed, and very importantly, the Audit and National Procurement Commissions were also added to the list of independent commissions. Now, the 19th Amendment also sought to reduce the powers of the president vis-à-vis the prime minister. As you know, there was a campaign for the abolition of the executive presidency as a transitional or temporary measure. The 19th Amendment sought to reduce the powers of the president and increase the powers of the prime minister, so that you had a greater balance, if you like, between the office of the president and the prime minister. And unfortunately, I think this is the aspect of the 19th Amendment that has been subject to criticism. And that's probably not so much because of the constitutional provisions themselves, but more to do with the two people who occupied the position of president and prime minister, who seemed, by their temperament and by their personalities, incapable of working with the other person. So that's more a political point rather than a constitutional stroke legal point. There were other problems with the 19th Amendment, and I think it's important to recognize this. There were committee stage amendments introduced at the last minute, which were inappropriate. For example, the committee stage amendment on dual citizenship, the age of presidential candidates. These were ad hoc, ad hominem amendments, and in a sense, the model authority of the framers of the 19th Amendment was seriously undermined by that last-minute attempt at change. So the question that I would like to pose to you is, the government seems extremely fond of talking about the fact that they have a mandate to abolish the 19th Amendment or to repeal the 19th Amendment. I think this argument of a mandate is extremely dangerous. A mandate can be used to justify everything. How do we know what the people actually voted for? Did they vote against? Did they vote against the utter dysfunction in the Yahapalana government? Or did they vote to do away with independent commissions, right? So the notion of a mandate in political theory is extremely dangerous because it can be used to basically justify anything and everything. So we need to unpick what was the mandate really for. And I submit to you that it was more about voting against the dysfunction of the previous government, the apparent inability of the government to remove the IGP, but it was possible to remove the IGP, but for various reasons it was not done, the drift and the internal divisions in the government, which culminated, I think, in the tragedy of Easter Sunday. So if that seemed to have been the reason for the unpopularity of the 19th Amendment, my question is, deal with those aspects of the 19th Amendment through the 20th Amendment. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and undermine the whole notion of independence and depoliticization of key institutions. And I think that this is what our political leadership should do at this time. I'd like to conclude with the point that seems to have attracted a lot of media attention in the last couple of days. And that is the fact that Parliament's ability to exercise full and effective control over public finance with the assistance of the Audit and National Procurement Commissions will be seriously undermined by the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. And I think that this is something that we really need to focus on. I was reading today that the President has, by a gazette of the 25th of September, taken a large number of departments and institutions under the Presidential Secretariat. And if the 20th Amendment is going to preclude effective scrutiny and audit and financial control of all those institutions, huge development projects on Colombo City, e-governance, various things, all the task forces, if all that is going to be effectively taken outside the scrutinizing power of Parliament, how on earth is Parliament going to effect full and effective control over public finance? And I'm extremely happy that it seems as if some elements within the government have expressed serious concern about this. But in conclusion, I think what is even most bizarre is that at the end of the day, if the 20th Amendment is passed, it will be passed, as you know, by members of Parliament. The members of Parliament are going to, in effect, weaken their powers, weaken their ability to have an impact on governance. And to me, it's just bizarre that the members of Parliament seem serious about introducing an amendment to the Constitution that is basically going to make an overmighty executive a hyper-presidential system. So don't look at France, don't look at America anymore. You need to look at the Russian Constitution. I think the Russian Constitution and the Sri Lankan Constitution will have much more in common if the 20th Amendment is passed. And Parliament and members of Parliament are going to, in effect, remove the limited powers that they already have. And I wonder whether any self-respecting member of Parliament, how he or she is going to justify that course of action. Thank you very much.